how do people really learn? At a Newspring, we create experiences with leading learning pioneers like Dr. Flipa Hartman, Julie Dirksen, and Lauren Waldman to explore just that and more. Don't miss our next Love to Learn experience, an event series to help and inspire you to create training based on how people learn best. Find out what's coming up at anewspring.com/events.
If you're in workplace Learning Technologies 2025 should definitely be on your radar. It's happening 23rd to 24th of April at Excel London, and the scale is huge. 11,000 visitors, 1,000 conference delegates, and a free exhibition with over 200 L&D solution suppliers. The conference theme, People, Technology in the Future, Decision Time, taps into the biggest topics in L&D right now. With 80 expert speakers and 30 sessions, they'll cover AI, skills, personal growth, and practical L&D essentials. Booking opens at the end of January. Check out learningtechnologies.co.uk for more info. What comes into your head? What thoughts and feelings arise when I pronounce the three-letter acronym D.E.I?
Most people, D.E.I is about hiring people that are racialized and genderized, that are not qualified for the jobs that they get. That's the definition that a lot of bad actors have put into the ether. And if you say something over and over again, people start believing it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's true.
But is it true? Has D.E.I gone too far? Is the D.E.I firestorm unleashed in the early days of Trump's second term just a necessary correction for something that's got completely out of hand? Or is it a full-scale assault on social justice?
Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning.
Learning is fun.
Knowledge is power. Knowledge. Education.
Learning professionals are still reeling from the abrupt and radical upending of established certainties brought about by the new administration in the US. Many don't know how to react. Few of the CLOs I regularly interview even want to address the subject. So I wanted to talk to someone who makes a living out of running DEI programs for large multinational corporations. His name is Amri.
Hack Facts.
Amri B. Johnson is a strategist, author, and thought leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion. American-born but now based in Basel, Switzerland, he is the CEO of Inclusion Wins, advising organizations on integrating inclusive practices into their business strategies. With a background in public health and organizational development, Amri has spent over 2 decades helping businesses create sustainable, equitable workplaces. He is also the author of Reconstructing Inclusion, which examines the effectiveness of current DEI models and proposes practical improvements.
This week, I will also end the government policy of trying to socially engineer race and gender into every aspect of public and private life. We will forge a society that is colorblind and merit-based.
The atmosphere in American politics is so febrile that it's hard to know how deep and permanent this change is going to be. One thing's clear, in the short term, it's bumpy times ahead for people like Amri. And as corporations not only in the US but worldwide cut back their DEI programs, a serious question has to be asked. Is D.E.I. D.O.A.? So Amri, it's a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. Welcome to The Learning Hack.
Glad to be here, John. Thank you.
We're recording this interview towards the end of February 2025, and the reason I want to put a date stamp on our discussion like that is because we're in a time of very rapid and transformative change affecting the field in which you are an expert, DEI. the new US administration's stance on DEI is not just a rhetorical assault. We've had quite a lot of that in previous years anyway, but it's an attempt to, or seems to be an attempt to extirpate DEI entirely from the corporate and cultural fabric. The activities of DOGE have shut down and defunded DEI initiatives in government, fired staff who have DEI functions and responsibilities. Plane crashes and even the destruction of large areas of Los Angeles by fire recently have been blamed on DEI. Many large corporates, following the trends set by the new administration, are dropping or overhauling DEI policies and schemes. And since business is now so globalized and supply chains so interlinked, this is not just a US phenomenon, but it's shaking things up in Europe as well. I say many of the people who listen to this podcast will work for organizations that either have a US headquarters or a US operation afoot in that territory and will be affected by it for that reason. And also it has a wider kind of influence. So my first question to you, sorry for that long preamble, is this. Short question, do you still have a job?
Yes, John, I'm still standing.
Great, glad to hear it. One of the effects of the change is to make a lot of people who previously might have muttered dark things about DEI in private, but have chosen not to be too public about it, come out and say them out loud. Something you hear a lot now is, well, yes, I broadly believe in DEI, but really it's gone a bit too far. How do you react to that type of criticism?
It's legitimate. And I think part of the challenge is that it was quiet and people did not feel like they could say it. It wasn't private for me. People actually talked to me about their challenges with it. And because they either read my book or they watched something that I've talked about, there are a lot of things that were not working in the space. And that's not just the past 5 years. It just got amplified the past 5 years with the heavier focus on racialization, heavier focus on discrimination, and raising the, I guess I can say, the volume on the victimhood narrative. I've been writing for a while, John, on something called quantum victimhood. I haven't published much on it yet, but it's kind of like taking the victimization from the past, which in many cases was quite bad for many people, and projecting it into the future. And it really takes away human agency. It takes away all the things that really allow people to thrive in organizational life. And that's been the narrative that many people that see DEI as negative have latched onto. I get it. And like any narrative, it's incomplete. And so I'd like to be able to move closer to the more complete narrative and be mindful and openly critical of the stuff that's not working. We haven't done that in our field, and we haven't been willing to engage with people who are so-called against DEI or anti-DEI or ambivalent about DEI in a more, I'd say, honest discussion about what could be and as opposed to what is.
Okay, so let's talk about the language of DEI specifically a bit. In a talk you gave on YouTube, you spoke about having recently discovered the word diaphobic, meaning fear of dialogue, and how that fear is a bad thing for DEI. But many of DEI's critics would say the opposite. They would say that DEI is inherently diaphobic. In other words, it shuts down dialogue by policing speech, encouraging people to focus on the extent to which they feel oppressed, and weaponizing their oppression, whether it's real, exaggerated, or even occasionally made up, as a power move to silence opposition. We hear this kind of accusation quite a lot in the context of higher education, for instance. To what extent, if any, do you think that type of characterization has validity?
I think there's been a lot of people that are, I guess, passionate about DEI that have not been open to dialogue in the way that would be helpful. I think dialogue is an art that's not done very well in organizations beyond the DEI conversation. And in the DEI conversation, dialogue has been exchanged for, make wrongs and in a way, retribution for what people have believed was done wrong to people like them in the past. I don't think any of it works. I think if we did the dialogue, we would have been able to see where the challenges were with what people were kind of anchoring on. And we would have been able to pull out the things that I think are fundamentally essential for organizational life, to understand interdependence, to help people understand their agency, to make sure people know that they matter, that their work matters, that's been reinforced because of the contributions that they're making, to make people know that this is a place that they can be a part of something bigger than themselves. This is a place where they can thrive. I think if we anchored on those things, and have a dialogue about what that means and what's possible and how it positively impacts organizations, we'd have a different conversation about DEI. But unfortunately, John, that's not what a lot of people did. There were a lot of people, and I'll make this part short. A lot of people got into this space because they saw opportunity to get something for themselves. I'm a capitalist. I want to make money too. But you don't go into an organization without depth and take them down a road that's this challenging without having depth. And a lot of people didn't have that depth. And I've been irritated with those people, for lack of a better word, because we could do better, and a lot of people were doing better, but that's not what the narrative is about. It's about those that created the opposite of the conditions that I think we need to make inclusion normative in organizational life.
Perhaps another facet of that is the language, and the language of DEI is that a problem? I mean, we have this whole kind of lexicon of, deconstruction, a lot of kind of philosophical imports from the continental philosophy tradition, Derrida, deconstruction, reconstruction, a language of microaggressions and so on. It's very much the kind of argot of a graduate class for those who feel outside that, and who very often themselves, maybe for class reasons, feel oppressed. Class is very often left out of the DEI discussion, feel that they're being shut down and excluded. It's a language game. Wittgenstein would call it a language game. Not, the game is not to kind of lessen the importance of the issues involved, but in the philosophical sense that Wittgenstein says, it's a language game. And in a game, people are excluded, and you have what the right now calls non-player characters. In the past, we've seen the development of a kind of counter argot to this, another language game, which, you could say the MAGA tendency has invented, where you have non-player characters. You have a DEI hire, which is, an awful phrase, and so on. Short question, is the language a problem?
The language has been a problem because it hasn't been accessible to everyone. And whenever something that you put into an organization is not accessible to them, that creates an in and out group. And if in and out groups are created, which subsequently pretty much always happens in organizations, but if you're practicing or you're putting something into the organization that intentionally or unintentionally or by happenstance creates an us and them, I think you need to examine it a lot closer. And I think some of that language has been problematic. That's another word that became big over the past few years, the word problematic. But the whole issue of using language that's not accessible to people or is make wrong for people of a certain hue or gender or what have you, it's not accessible, and therefore it's not going to be helpful. And so if you're going to use language, you have to make sense of it together. Right? Wittgenstein also said words create worlds. Yeah. And so how can you shape those words in a way that people know that this is about us and not about them? I've been very deliberate about moving away from that us-them dynamic in the past few years. Language has sometimes increased it because people wanted to use those words to be right instead of to create the conditions for everyone to do their best work and thrive.
I'm coming quite heavy on the negatives of this interview so far, and there are further attack angles I'd like to give you a chance to tackle, but we really ought to hear now about your practice and your distinctive take on DEI, which is beginning to emerge from your answers here. But can you tell us a bit about your 2022 book, Reconstructing Inclusion, and your work with Inclusion Wins? And something that's just occurred to me within that question as well is, are you going to change the language that you use when talking about DEI?
It's a good question. And a lot of my colleagues are starting to change their titles and refer to things like culture and inclusion and belonging. And I wrote Reconstructing Inclusion as my movement to skate toward where the puck was going. And I'll share this story with you. When I was internal, I started developing this theory of change that was really about the right networks, the right interactions on a regular basis, contact across difference, across disciplines, really focusing on inclusion as core, and to make sure that people knew that this was about how do we address the systemic things that can help us all be better every day in our work together. So that was at the heart of what I was trying to do and skating to where the puck was going. So I don't really need to change language, John, because the language that I've been using has been consistent. In fact, when I, in that story, before I go into it, Trump's last executive order in 2020, some of it was just silly political language, but a lot of it was really clear. Like, we're focusing on inclusion, and inclusiveness is a good thing. The executive order now is ambiguous and doesn't allow people to know what to do. There's no guidance on one way or the other. So there was no intention to make inclusion something that we know and the research says is helpful. So when I was inside, and I've done this with other organizations since I've been running Inclusion Wins, since I moved to Switzerland in 2019, I opened up in 2021, my firm, Inclusion Wins. But when I was inside, I was working with a team. They were part of the drug safety team for the organization, and they were having issues with the project team leaders because project team leaders try to move the project forward, and safety people oftentimes have to slow the project for safety reasons. And the problem wasn't that safety was a problem, or the problem wasn't that the project team leaders were the problem. The problem was they weren't in dialogue with each other about what they needed to do to catch safety issues early so it didn't end up slowing the project down. And so we start figuring out, how do we have a different conversation? How do we have a different contract in the way teams and including the safety professionals worked? And what it was an example of exclusion, but not realizing it. These safety people weren't part of the conversations after the meeting after the meeting, which always happens where decisions are made. And when they start being included in that and they got agreement about that, they were able to save time on the project. And if you know anything about drug discovery, John, it's not cheap. And so you're talking, if you do the math, 10 to 15 years between $2 and $2.5 billion. So just say it's about $5 million a day. So anytime you can save time by having better relational fitness or relational skills, as I often talk about them, that's when you can see how inclusion brings value to an organization in ways that it's not always easily measurable. But in that case, I think we can measure it if we just put the right metrics behind it and show what's possible. So that's why I wrote Reconstructing Inclusion, and the subtitle is making inclusion, diversity, accessible, actionable, and sustainable, making sure that people knew this is for everyone, making sure that it was prioritized appropriately so people have the skills and capabilities to put it into action in their everyday and the way we do things around here, which is culture. And then, of course, that it was aligned with what the organization was up to in its mission. So those were the fundamental principles of Reconstructing Inclusion, and that's how I've practiced for the past 20 years, and that's how I'll continue to practice. It's different because we got found out, those who were doing the work in a way that wasn't helpful. And now I think in a way it's somewhat of a course correction. Some of my colleagues will not agree with me on that. They think it's an all-out assault. But if we had been mindful and honest and in dialogue and being critical of ourselves, which is big for me, I'm more critical than anybody could ever be of me, of myself. If we would have been more critical of ourselves, we probably would have at least mitigated the dynamics and in some cases pretty big damage that's been done to the field as a result of what's happening. I'm not saying everybody's acting in good faith on the side of DOJ or the Republican Party, but I can say that we have some cause in the matter, and reconstructing inclusion was an attempt, and still something that I firmly believe in, is something that can move us in the right direction to take and pull everything apart, see what was working, what wasn't, and use what was working to move the work forward.
Listening to you speak, it raises the question for me that, okay, we have seen in the past a lot of people in organizations giving lip service to DEI, which therefore makes it a lot easier than just completely junk it overnight, which we're seeing a lot of now. On the other hand, it does seem that this philosophy of inclusion as being actually a kind of route to a more dynamic organization, to a safer organization, is really very well embedded in a lot of companies, and therefore they are kind of going to stick with it, even if they call it something else, even if it goes under the radar.
Exactly.
Is that your belief that, it must be your belief that essentially the thing that you believe in and you work on is vital, a real thing, a real benefit to organizations, and so will survive despite, the firestorm that's happening on the surface politically and culturally?
If you're looking to connect with the top minds in learning and talent, there's no better place than an iVentive event. That's IVENTIV. Since 2009, they've hosted nearly 300 interactive conversational events exclusively for senior leaders like global heads of learning. I've been a sponsor myself and found these events invaluable. Less about sitting and listening, more about real, impactful conversations. It's an unmatched opportunity to collaborate with leading chief learning officers on the challenges they're tackling today. Join the conversation. Visit iventive.com/learninghack. That's iventive.com/learninghack.
You have to respond to the political environment that's in play right now. You can't get away from it. And, if you build your systems to create the conditions for everyone, knowing that everybody has their unique needs, you end up better off. It doesn't matter if you call it DEI or not. Obviously, I like the word inclusion, so I want people to hire me because I have depth in the notion of inclusion for all that means, for all that's worth. And I'm pretty certain that organizations that decide not to do it or create a space where people can come in and be jerks and uncivil and toxic, the results of that are way bigger perhaps than this whole kind of focus on DEI, which for most people, John, just to be clear, most people, DEI is about hiring people that are racialized and genderized, that are not qualified for the jobs that they get. That's the definition that a lot of bad actors have put into the ether. And if you say something over and over again, people start believing it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And so because that's been the conversation, and because a lot of diversity people have focused on representation, we got to get more people in senior levels. We need more Black CEOs or women CEOs. I'm like, yeah. And is that really going to get us what we want to see? And the answer is, it has been, no. We've been at this for a very long time and it hasn't worked. Inclusion has worked. If you build people's capabilities over time, they're going to be ready to move into those jobs. And in some cases, they're not going to get them because there is bias in the system. And if you want to address that, you address that with data. There's plenty of data to show if people are not, people are performing at a high level, they're getting this, and that, and you compare them to somebody else that got a higher level, and you see that over time, multiple times, you can be like, well, we might have some bias in this system that's keeping us from getting the best talent. Full stop. This is not blame the white dude, blame the system, blame systemic racism. It doesn't work. If it worked, I'd be like, great, this is actually helping organizations thrive. But it doesn't, John. So for me, move away from the focus and fixation on as one of my mentors, Roosevelt Thomas, said in his 1991 book, Beyond Race and Gender, move away from that sole focus on civil rights, social justice, and affirmative action of the 60s and 70s in the U.S., and move towards a paradigm where everybody gets what they need to perform, to fulfill their best potential, and to thrive. That's the turn that I think we've been trying to make for those of us that have been practicing with any depth. And then other people just want to hold on to that past. But we're seeing that it's crumbled. It already had cracks. And now, it's kind of in shambles, and we're going to have to pick up the pieces that work and move those forward versus the ones that we probably should have let go of a long time ago.
If we talk now about DEI training specifically, there has been credible empirical research showing that DEI training initiatives, when you look at the data, just don't work. They just don't change attitudes. Are we just doing it wrong? Or, on the other hand, is human psychology just more intractable, less persuadable than we like to hope and believe? And again, if you can find a way of changing minds, and here is another attack line, isn't that just coercion or even brainwashing? Why should your employer control how you feel?
Your employer shouldn't control how you feel. That's a ridiculous notion. And I think some people felt empowered by coming in and being the hero for the organization and all the so-called marginalized people. I don't believe that kind of education works. I've seen good training around inclusion, around understanding bias in decision-making, around the skills that I believe are inclusion skills. They're relational skills. They're understanding what you can do to help people kind of have a level of vertical development, giving them the right projects, doing really good coaching, bringing people together that probably wouldn't get together to work on something because you're going to bring in these different viewpoints and perspectives to whatever you're trying to transform, change in the organization. So is DEI training inherently bad or good? No, there's bad training in every organization across all disciplines in the training. The DEI training has gotten a target on it because a lot of it's been where it's been blaming a particular group or another. And it wasn't really, I'd say, inclusion training. It was more anti-racism and so-called social justice related work that didn't necessarily just create an understanding of the history and bring people together to talk about what might get in the way of people doing their best work with each other, but it came in to, blame people and make them feel guilty. And guilt just doesn't work. It just makes you start blaming people. Responsibility works. Like, where can I be responsible as an organizational contributor? How can I be responsible for this notion of interdependence in my organization and how I contribute to my colleagues because of that interdependence? How can I be responsible for being the best manager, team member, colleague that I can possibly be, and take people's interest into account as I do it? That's just being a person that is mostly concerned about business success, not just about themselves. Obviously, we all have our own selfish notions. So is DEI training bad or good? There's some bad DEI training. There's some good education for people to be inclusive every day and incorporated that into what they do every day. And I don't think we always spend enough time on that. And it doesn't have to be in a classroom. It can be things that we just bring people together to have a conversation about and decide that we're going to practice it for a period of time and then come back and talk about what we learned. So that's what I think. There's things that can enable learning and growth and innovation, and people feeling like they belong and that they matter. And there's stuff that should shift that away, and we need to move that stuff away and move towards what we want. And I think there's a way to do that. And a lot of the training that we've seen over the past few years that was mostly focused on, race and racism, I don't think it's done that to the extent that it could. And for those that did it, applause. But most of them did not, because they did not have the depth to go beyond, a session or a dialogue. They didn't build it to be anything more than that. And it left people in the valley, as I say, instead of being able to guide them up the mountain. And you don't want to leave people in the valley because they'll let you know later. They'll just stay quiet about it. And that's what's happening now. They're like, I didn't like that. I don't like the way I felt. Versus, hey, we're trying to come together closer. And we missed the mark on that in many cases. But there's another way. And that's what we're committed to.
Yeah, and one thing that result makes me think is that, perhaps within the context of an organization, these might be the beliefs that we kind of hold and believe and want to disseminate. In the wider society, that's not where the dialogue is. So actually, you mentioned kind of in and out groups. It made me think of innies and outies in Severance, and there, if you've seen that box there. It's the second one I've referred to in our conversation. I've obviously watched too much television. But it does, there is a kind of difference between our innies and our outies, our work people and our outside people. But the outside debate, beliefs, the organic feel of what the culture and the society is about differs from what it is within organizations. And in organizations, it has been, I suppose you could call it, more liberal. There is this phenomenon of woke capital, which I know is part of the language game of the right, if you like. But it's kind of a phenomenon you notice is that within work there is a different debate than what there is in politics and society outside, which kind of raises the question of, well, how do you look at that? Is on the one hand, you might say this is an example of leadership, that organizations are giving leadership that politicians are kind of failing to give in the area of inclusion. Another thing is that it's a weird bubble where HR departments are trying to control what people think and has nothing to do with the outside world and is detached. It's that a problem that changing the way that we practice DEI within organizations can fix? Or, what I'm leading towards here is the proper posture to what's going on outside resistance? Or is it, well, let's just change the way that we're talking, the way we're badging this thing, the way that we're practicing?
I think organizations can be this kind of crucible to bring people together that normally wouldn't come together. We are tribal people. We usually hang out with people we know best. We might live in parts of town that are, racialized in one direction or another, or have certain social circles in another. So we don't necessarily come across people that are inherently different than us in a lot of people's lives. So the organizations have a chance to bring people together across difference in ways that very few other places can as an institution. And so as an institution, if you have institutional support for people to, do their best to create the conditions for each other, to understand their interdependence with each other, and to work on something that they both believe in over a period of time where they get to know who each other are. And this is really important, John. And it's really important because we've been focused a lot on what people are. We haven't been focused enough on who they are. And organizations create a space. They can create this space where people can spend enough time together over a lengthy period of time to get to know who each other are. And that's not something we've done enough of. I'm big on networks. I'm big on, weak ties in networks. Are we making more connections with those weak ties in our organization? Or are we just kind of bonding with people like ourselves, whether by discipline or by department or by division, in a big company? We could do better at finding ways to bring people together across any types of similarity or difference to do something important for the company and to build the relational capital in organizations that I think helps organizations thrive and innovate. That to me, that's important. Understanding the who takes time. What we've done now is we categorize people as what? I'm the black man, for lack of a better word, because that's what people might reduce me to. But I live in Switzerland. I was born in Topeka, Kansas. There's minimum four languages and 3 dialects spoken in my house, in my home. I've lived all over the world. I've traveled all over the world. I'm a writer. I'm a dad. I'm a stepdad. I'm a husband. I'm a jazz aficionado. I'm a hip hop head. I'm all these things. But to reduce me to my African American blackness, whatever, is reductionist, and it's not helpful because it doesn't let you know who I am. We need to understand who each other are. We need to move away from focusing on what.
I think that's a great answer. I'm not being very balanced in saying that, but I think that was a really good answer. But the attacks still come, I'm afraid. So I have another naughty question for you.
I know, just by the way, John, I appreciate your questions, because a lot of the people are not being honest with where we are. They're now just going against and saying Trump is this and Musk is that. They might be absolutely right, but it's not helpful to moving the space forward. And that's why I appreciate what you're sharing.
Okay. Right. So another attack on the space. If we look at the wider HR context, there's a narrative that assumes DEI is in opposition to merit-based hiring and promotion. What we're getting at here, the DEI hire. I know you don't like binaries, so what can you say that might help people who disagree with you on DEI see beyond that binary? Are they 100% wrong? And if so, what proofs can you offer that the narrative is wrong?
There are good hires and there are bad hires. Excuse me. Let me rephrase that, because I'm not a binary guy. There are people that work out for a role and they actually plugged in and they did their job well. And there are people that didn't do it as well. Most organizations are made up of mediocre people. That is the truth. That's why companies have this bell curve. I don't believe in it, but that's what happens, right? Every organization is made up of mostly mediocre people with a few extraordinary folks on the right tail. And so that means that if we're just hiring on merit, what does it mean? The best people qualify for the best job. Did you get them in your talent pipeline to begin with, or are these just the best people you could encounter based on the recruitment processes you have right now? So that's one question. Number two is, what is meritocracy? Do you understand why the phrase was even coined? The phrase was not coined to weaponize it against people for not being excellent, which is that new thing, merit, excellence, and intelligence, I think they're saying out of certain places. That was not the point. The point was there were people who were well off that had lots of resources that gave their children extraordinary opportunities to do extraordinary things because they had the resources to help them get there. And there were others that did not start at the same place. It doesn't make the ones with more wrong. It doesn't make the ones with less capable and with less potential. And so what we've done is we've convoluted the idea of merit with the idea that because you got something based on a particular criteria of a particular employer, that you were better than somebody who is different than you that didn't get it, or that did get it, that they're worse than you. And so I think the convolution, and this is people repeating this idea over and over again. There's lots of books on this, even The Rise of Meritocracy, where meritocracy came from. I suggest people read it. And to understand that merit does not, is absolutely something we want everybody to have more of. We want everybody to be able to be great at their jobs. And DEI did not put that down. There were times that people were put in positions that they probably shouldn't have been in, but it wasn't just because of their race or ethnicity. There's been a lot of people that have been put in those positions across all the spectrum of similarities and difference that shouldn't have been put in that job, and they didn't do well, or they're not doing well. And that's part of any organization. It has nothing to do with DEI hires or lack of merit. When you hired them, you thought they could do the job. They just couldn't cut it at a particular time. And on the flip side, sometimes you hire people, you weren't sure, you thought they had potential, but you weren't sure if they were going to get there. And they outperformed every expectation. So, I think we want to reduce this to find fault. And it's hard to get people to change their mind when they've been told something over and over again. And the reality is, look at the data. Like, if people aren't performing, organizations should get rid of them or move them to a different role where they can perform. But pointing out and saying that somebody failed because they were a hire based on their identifiable characteristics is silly and untrue and has never been the case. And if it has been the case, it shouldn't have been for maybe a few organizations that might have done something silly like that. And eventually what happens if you do it, the people end up struggling and end up exiting. And so if you did that, you didn't even solve the problem that you thought you were solving. So make sure that people are prepared to do their job and have the potential to do it at a high level. And if they're not making it, make some decisions about what that means. And I think that's what I think most companies did. And if there were some examples where they didn't, those are outliers. They're really a small percentage. And if people are criticizing that, they should.
I suppose another answer to your initial question there about meritocracy, where did it come from? From UK perspective, I suppose you'd say that it was invented by the middle classes and weaponized against the aristocracy to dislodge elites. And from that point of view, came from the Labour movement, Labour Party, the left. Seems one of the big problems is meritocracy is something that is being weaponized by the other end of things.
Exactly,
and the libs
John.
are suffering from it. The libs are getting the libs now are getting kind of broadsides in the same language and on the same issues that they weaponized against the aristocratic elites to bring about a more bourgeois society, perhaps, and under attack. That's perhaps one of the reasons they don't know how to respond.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because you're like, well, how do I respond to this? Like, the nuance is lost, John. I mean, you're a well-read human being, and because you understand nuance. And D.E.I. is highly about nuance. Inclusion is highly about nuance. Some things are relatively straightforward, but nothing is black and white. I think you probably heard Thomas Sowell say, and many economists say, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. The trade-offs that we ended up making over the past few years in the D.E.I. space were trade-offs toward kind of a focus on racialization. It didn't work in the 90s. And we've had, this is not the first iteration of this matrix of people pushing it back against diversity and then diversity and inclusion and now D.E.I. It's not the first or the last time, perhaps, if we keep going back to the old. But I think this has always been the case that people have pushed back on this. Even people push back on affirmative action. There was a time for it. That time is over. Now we have to build systems that if you want quality, build your systems for it. Go upstream. Make sure these kids, these schools that are horrible in parts of various countries are reformed. Don't get rid of everything that was working. Figure out what's working and what's not and put more into what's working. We spend a lot of time on what's broken. And what you look for, you find. What you focus on grows. What you look for, you find. What you focus on grows. If you focus on what you want, if we focus on getting schools better, we focus on giving the teachers the resources they need. If you focus on getting kids early exposure to things that they oftentimes don't have exposure, particularly those who are from less socially, economically viable or what's the word? Rich.
Advantaged.
More disadvantaged backgrounds, you have to give them the right resources. This is not about preferencing them. It's about giving them something that allows them to make their best contributions to society that pays off in spades over time. But we haven't had those conversations. We've only had conversations about, victimhood and lack of agency and a missed opportunity and holding, white men accountable. All don't work. We need to focus on the things that are most important. We need to keep doing that. And if we want it to be sustained, we have to do it upstream and understand that this is a we, in the case of the United States, or we, the people of the United States, in the terms of Europe, it's our societies and cantons, etc., doing everything we can to give kids the best opportunity. I feel very good about the way the Swiss education system is. Is it 100% perfect? No, but all kids will get a chance to do something, either through an apprenticeship or to going all the way to university, that they can come and be productive contributors to the communities that they're a part of. We haven't done that to the extent that we need to in other parts of the Western world. And a lot of the D.E.I. kind of the retribution, or my words are not so crisp today, John. The reparative processes that we put in place, we wouldn't need them if we built the right systems for people to get what they need way before it's problematic.
Yeah. But I think your words have been pretty crisp throughout this interview.
Well, thank you. My words are important to me, so when I stumble on them, I'm like, whoa, it's not good for me.
Yeah. Well, I know the feeling. It's terrible for a podcast, but there you go. And nuance, yes, very important. I do kind of feel I make my living out of nuance, and I wonder if I should feel queasy about that.
The honesty, even if you don't use the word nuance, life is messy.
Yeah.
And that's where the nuance lies. You know? And so, like, you can spend a lot of time being, if you're a so-called liberal at the way what's happening now, and you could also just get into action to create what you want to create in the world. We don't, to spend a lot of time being angry right now, I get it, but, you know, we're a month out. He's been in a month, and so what do you want to create? Keep doing that. And that's my advice to DEI people. Go create what you want to create. I know it's hard, and now it's the time to turn and skate to where the puck is. Because right now the puck is can only move toward, in my opinion, inclusion and creating cultures where people feel know that they matter and feel like they belong. That's the way forward, and I'm betting my company on it, John.
Wow, it's a big bet. Lastly, people who are interested in these issues and may have had questions raised themselves, where should they go to find out more about this? I mean, these things. And who do you follow that you can recommend?
In the UK, I follow Dr. Jonathan Ashon-Lamptey. He focuses on evidence-based inclusion.
Yeah.
I follow a lot of people who I think have concepts that are akin to inclusion. So I follow Jeff Marlowe. He's out of Cambridge in the UK. Okay. And he talks about future fit cultures. It's brilliant work. I follow Dr. Richard Clayton out of, I think he's in Hong Kong or Singapore now. He's a kind of transdisciplinary behavioral scientist. I follow Dr. Lauren Starr. She writes on evidence-based inclusion. Mm-hmm. Those are the people. And then I follow a lot of other people on LinkedIn that are more organizational development people. And I could probably give you a list of names if you wanted to put them in the show notes.
I'd very much like to do that.
Yeah, because there's some people that they're signal, and there's a lot of noise, John. Mm. And so I found myself unfollowing. I still keep connected with people, but I unfollow them because a lot of what they're saying is noise, and a lot of that noise has created some of the kind of contentiousness that we're experiencing now. So I've been really big on working to find signal, and people that I mentioned are very much signal folks.
Very interesting. Meanwhile, Trump sits on a golden throne in Mar-a-Lago, drinking liberal tears from a goblet of gold, a goblet of fire. It's probably not going to last forever. And well, you know, my advice to liberals would be, stop your sobbing. In the words of Chrissy Hind.
That's it. We don't have, people don't have time for that. I kind of came from a center-right home, so I don't know if I consider myself liberal, or I'm probably more center-right, center-left, depending on the topic. But kind of waiting and getting mad and spending all your time on rage is similar to what got us to where we are. is a lot of people were spending their time on rage, and they doubled down on the rage, and the rage has put us in the position that we're in right now. And we want to get out of it into a space of, like I always talk about, creating the right conditions. You can't do that by spending all your time criticizing this human being that has a bunch of power. And, hopefully I still believe in America. And if the power is unchecked, we'll have to deal with the consequences of that. But I still believe in the American edict, and that if it gets out of control, people will stand up and say no. And I hope he doesn't go there. It seems like he's projecting in that direction, but I hope it's just kind of a first start to keep the ratings up while he's doing other things behind the scenes.
So that note of positivity, I would say thank you for taking the time today, Amri. I've really enjoyed it. I hope people will get a lot from it.
Thank you so much, John. It was a delight.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review, and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
The Learning Hack is among the top 5% of shows most listened to globally, according to Listen Notes. And if you think your organisation could benefit from sponsoring the Learning Hack, or from using our knowledge and resources to start your own learning podcast, you can contact me on john@learninghackpodcasts.com. Until next time.
Stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.